family I have ever met.
You should ask my brother and sister about that.
Oh yes, you don't
They
exist
would
alone
call it
again.
dysfunctional, I guess.
Well, at least 3 of you are functional. You mentioned, Thomas, that the biggest consumers of your product are corporations, correct? That the people are interested in
not in
markets.
quantity, but what has surprised us is that it ranged from schools to NGOs to governments to corporate, and not only corporate, Goldman Sachs and UBS, all the way up in the money.
So let's make the case for why philanthropists should also be clamoring for this information. Because I think that's really the point, and we follow very nicely actually on the colleagues from Social Initiative, I think, because the question is, first, why is ignorance a problem in terms of decision making? But specifically for this audience, why is it a problem when you're making decisions about where to invest your philanthropic dollars? So when you first started becoming concerned about the public's general lack of awareness about this information, why? What is it that bothers you about ignorance, and why is it dangerous?
The main obstacle throughout these decades have remained the division of the world in industrialized and developing. And in developing, you put then Argentina and Turkey together with Somalia and Afghanistan, and it just doesn't make sense. You take Karl XII, the war king of Sweden, and you put him together with Tage Erlander, the creator of the welfare state, and it's just 2 different worlds. So that was how we started. Mm-hmm. And then we've seen that people are aware of the ugliness and horror of deep poverty and war, and they know the welfare, but they don't understand that most people live in between. The majority of the world population have a light bulb and they want a washing machine. That's in between where they live today. And we still have ugly extreme poverty. Not to mention what happens in northern Nigeria to the schoolgirls. That exists, but most have moved out to it. So this, we want to give a fact-based worldview of it. And then you can choose to invest. Of course, the most important is extreme poverty, but that's also very difficult to do something about. So you may find that traffic accidents in the mid-area is something you really want to work on. Or the rights for young women who have had education to start companies in India. That's a fair choice to work on that. But you should know what you're doing. You should know the choice you have made.
And what you just mentioned, traffic accidents, that's something a lot of people aren't aware of, has a very high burden of mortality for people. So it might not be obvious to people where there are actually good opportunities for investing.
It kills more women than pregnancy does.
Right. And
women are often walking on the street. They're often in poor countries. They're often exposed even more to traffic than men.
And home stoves, some of those pictures that you showed, are often a cause of injury and death. And so for people who don't understand that, it's hard to know that that's a really good place to invest your money. Are there other areas where you think that there are good opportunities for investment? If people were looking for opportunities where there's a meaningful lever of change right now in the global public health arena, what would you think would be good places to be investing?
I think there are 2 things on investing. Business can do much better by adapting their product and business model to the poorest people. Take menstruation pads. Teenage girls in Africa need a menstruation pad that lasts from morning to evening because there's no place in secondary school easily where they can change it. If you make that menstruation pad, she would honor that brand long into her adult life. That business can do. NGOs are not needed. But then discussing that young women have the right to go to school, so organize the schools for them, to help them with a fellowship, just to pay it. Sometimes blunt money is what's needed. Well-guided blunt money can help girls, That's where philanthropy and business cannot do that, because the payback is in 20 years.
So one of the things I teach about in our massive open online course about effective charitable giving is how much it helps a nonprofit organization to be clear about why it exists and what opportunity it can pursue for making a difference. And I wanted to ask you, in terms of Gapminder, being a nonprofit organization, how did being clear about this ignorance problem help you decide strategically where the opportunity was for you to make a difference? How did you define the need concretely that you wanted to address?
It helps us not doing the alternatives, and those were fighting for open data access, for example. We've been involved in that a lot, but we decided other people are really capable of doing that, and it's not at our core, though we do support it, but we have stopped spending time and going to conferences for free access to open public statistics in rich countries. We love it, but we will focus on something else. Another thing is the visualization community who wants us to do more cool visualizations. No, we're not interested in visualization as such. It's just a tool, okay? And we ended up being able of not participating too much and wasting time. So that I think is the core. It helps us to filter out what we should not spend time, though it's related to what we're doing. And when it comes to ignorance, it clarifies. For example, if someone, a UN agency asks us to create a nice presentation about landmines or something else, HIV in Cambodia, it sounds like a very good thing to do. Should we do it? When knowing our higher, longer-term mission, we yes can clearly say that we don't have the time to focus on these super important issues because we're trying to solve a bigger problem. And without clear guidance there, like what is the big problem there? Well, majority of people who are going to decide when they go to a market to buy something or they vote in a democratic election, if they only score 10% on these questions and the debate is about sustainable development, vaccination of children, where should aid money go, and they don't know anything, that's a huge problem. If we are not focusing on that, no one else will focus on it because then the problem wouldn't have existed. I think that is something that...
And I'd like to follow that by saying that kind of focus in understanding the relationship between the need that exists and your strategy for addressing it is something that donors can look for in you as an organization, but in general it's something that nonprofit organizations can strive for, and donors can be looking for that kind of clarity of purpose as an indicator that an organization is on the right track with a strategy.
I think donors sometimes come from a different background. You could even, just by asking this question, as was mentioned, you can help educate the nonprofits. Tell it nicely to them that, okay, your purpose is good, but please clarify it. We really like what we hear, but it's unclear. And with better strategy and more focus, you could do your work even better. So I'm not asking to be bad. I'm asking to help you improve. I think there is a lot of education that can be transferred in that direction.
One of the advantages that comes from having that clarity is then you can hold yourselves accountable for the difference that you set out to make. You have some sense of what changing the problem actually looks like. So I'm curious because the visuals are compelling, it's fun, it's interesting, but you're actually trying to move people's thinking and their actions. So how do you define impact for Gapminder? How do you hold yourselves accountable?
So there is, okay, the first is what audience are we reaching? The blogosphere like to blog about Hans's lectures, and it's easy to be focusing on the analytics on our website. We have 12,000 visitors a day, more or less 4 million people use our tools. But who are these people? They are people who like visual exploration on the internet, while the school children go and learn things from an outdated curriculum in school. So we really need to know who are we targeting, and it's actually regular school children, because that we can have a long-term impact if we can have them get a fact-based worldview when they leave schools. So we need to measure the usage of our tools inside schools and whether it has a knowledge impact. So we have set up a way to examine fact knowledge. We actually think that's very, very important. Like flexible discussions is nice, but did they actually get the facts? So 3 months after using our tools, we revisit the classroom and ask the slightly same question again, and we want to see 80% correct answers at least, or our tools were not good enough.
And if kids aren't getting it, then you know it's not.
Well, actually, the first thing we need to do is to educate their teachers. And that's a little bit embarrassing in the relationship to teachers sometimes when we tell them teach your students, and then we get certain ignorance among the teachers first. So Measuring impact, we set off on this impact on the students, but we also have to modify our impact measurement as we go. So now we're more into measuring whether the teachers got it or not. That's step one, so to say. Yeah.
So one of the things about impact, as desirable as it is for us to have metrics, and I think there's increasing interest in the donor world to get metrics of success and understand how we're measuring things. A lot of important work doesn't lend itself to being measured. A lot of the progress we need takes a long time. It costs more than anybody wants to admit, and it's harder to achieve.
Yes.
And I think public health gives us many examples of where we need that patient long-term investment. So Hans, how do you grapple with that tension between the pressure to show success and the knowledge that it's not always easy to count?
I like concrete examples. You're in a country where girls now go to school. They even come up to secondary school. And then they meet these horrendous limitations in life, one of which is rape. Just violence and rapes. Now, you cannot use statistics about rape to see whether your project to protect young women and girls from rape is having progress or not. Because when you increase awareness and people take a stand against rape, then rape will be more and more reported during 20 years. So we will just have it will seem as if you are a complete failure. Let's say you go and invest in a major city in India, you help them with this, and the only thing you will see is that the number of rapes are just going up, the reported number of rapes. It may be that the total number stands still because it takes a certain time until you get the impact. So this is, everyone understands this. And then you can have our aim is to increase the number of reported rapes per year. And you have to think a little what it is you would like to achieve. I also used to say that you work in very poor hospital, a very poor area in a hospital, you want a certain mortality in the hospital. If you have no mortality, it means that the severe cases are not even coming. And if you have no mortality on the severe case, it means you use too much resources there. So you have to think about these situations, and that's difficult for people who come from perfect companies with high quality assurance or countries with welfare states where people judge the color of the walls of the hospital, and they want a nice sofa to sit in after they've been to the doctor to evaluate whether there's quality in primary health care. The post-industrial mindset is difficult when it moves out, so you have to learn from colleagues, and that's very important. So, and probably where you can measure very clearly, government and business can solve the problem. Yeah. So government and business can solve it. So where you need to go with your money and your wisdom and the combination of heart and brain is where partly you will be used by numbers, but partly you have to be guided by judgment.
And I think it's important to always be aware that if you're trying to solve something big, it's going to take much more time than you would never ever imagine. And probably if you knew how much time it would take, you would probably not start from the beginning.
No,
but I think it's important to have that in mind as well, because having all these measurements that you are supposed to do short term might change your mindset. So you do measurable, minor, silly projects. But what is needed is something big and scalable and long term, and that is sometimes frustrating.
I think one of the benefits of enforcing measurement is to teach people to think clearly. Changing those measurements all the time might be part of a very, very creative and structured strategy. So yes, please ask for them, but the actual report must not be so important actually. Rather the logic of why do you want to change this measure next year? That's interesting. Is someone actually analyzing the purpose of the measure? That's fine, you can change it over and over again, but it should be there.
And the measure should be defined by the context, that complicated system. They shouldn't be arbitrary measures that impress the donors or that sound good.
Yeah.
They should be measures that actually reflect the circumstances, such as you said, getting more reported rapes is actually a positive indicator. It might not sound like it, but if you understand the context, then it really is.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
Also remember that if you invest wisely in one activity, which is really important, that will not be the only thing that impacts the outcome. This is very important. More than half of the fall in child mortality we have been seeing over the last years, in the last decades in the world, is due to increased female literacy. Now, that comes how long after leaving primary school at the age of 14, being mother at 28, you already have about 1.5 decade difference. And I asked once the Minister of Health in Vietnam and said, your country is miserably poor, the planning economy didn't function, and yet you are so healthy. How can you be so healthy? And she answered, grandma can read. Just think about that, grandmother can read. Then you invest in girls' education, there will eventually come a generation of young women who have a mother and a mother-in-law who supports them into the modern life. That's how long time it takes. And that business can never wait for that. Government can't wait for that. Government and business are useless in the same way. Sorry, useless, we should be respectful. Because they have short-term aims and they should have short-term aims. You have to take on the tough things where you can follow up for count decades, but keep measuring what can be measured.
And I think one of the challenges is if we adopt too short-term a view in philanthropy, we don't recognize that it's going to take possibly generations before our investments in philanthropy pay off, but that's okay, because it gives us the time to address the systemic issues. Another point you raised, Hans, that I think is very important is that when we invest in nonprofit organizations, we're often looking to hold the individual organization accountable for those short-term results. And I would say that there are probably no significant human problems in the world that a single organization can change all by itself. And so to hold one organization accountable for significant change makes no sense. I think we need to understand that context, but it's tricky because we're looking for organizations to deliver. It's a hard problem. I wanted to also ask you a question about the business model that you've decided to pursue at Gapminder, because we know that nonprofit organizations are businesses. You have to keep the lights on. If you don't have the money for the resources and the research and development, you can't do your work. So what have you learned about being sustainable as a nonprofit organization and having a business model that works for you?
Don't look at me. They both did.
Well, but they traced you out to do the show, so I think you're
that wasn't where Larry Page paid for the software.
Yeah, no, it's you need to have a father who is a professor, and you send him around the world to German banks and have him overcharge. That's how you do it. That's one way. If you can't do it that way, or if that is bringing in too little money, you need to come up with something else. Then basically by the roadshow Hans is running, we call it the roadshow, we get a lot of public interest, so of course that comes for free in our situation. But in addition to that, we need to have clear project plans. We're getting overwhelmed with consultant offers, but we're not going to say yes to those until we run out of money. So we have a business model which is combined of alternative sources of funding. We are a non-profit by strategy, just like Wikipedia is not a corporate, we're not, because this kind of content is more trustworthy, like the Nobel Prize, if it's not a company running it. So we definitely think it's the right format for this kind of activity. At the same time, we could be pulling in money through commercial activities, like when we sold the software to Google, we still have money left. So now with that money in the bank, we can go out and start new projects like those that we were showing, like the Dollar Street project. We define it clearly, and then we ask for funding for that project. So that's how it can work when you have built a brand that people know about, probably. To get there was pretty messy and ugly. It took a long time. The 2 first years after I dropped out, we did not have funding at all. My mother funded it for 2 years, so that we had food and a
I'm
computer.
not allowed, well, we are very much married, but I'm not allowed to use family money for anything. So
No, this is actually the first time I wanted to develop the first software. Hans said, no, actually I will not lend you money to buy that computer. It was, so we actually, and then you get all the fame.
Ja, just det. Rebecca, I think we have to start to wrap up and
Yep.
open up for a few questions perhaps also.
Yes, that
Time
would be,
flies.
it does.
You enjoy such a
Let's
nice
open the floor
conversation.
for questions.
So do we have a few, I can see one there, do we have microphones out?
report back the exact numbers of users, even though we may be more successful.
Hello, Jonas Martinsson.
Okay,
I just
we
think
have
it's, I just
cut
want
here,
to
and
say
it's
bravo, well done.
now.
I've
Rebecca,
used
thank you
your
so much
resource
for
base a lot.
leading this
Today
conversation.
now I know a lot more than I did. It's really great to be proud of what you've done. So I'm
Okay, that's nice. Anyone else? More questions?
Thank you very
Not
much.
one there, okay. You're asking more questions than I do.
Sorry. I wrote it down because someone's tend to confuse me. And so...
And we regather 5, 2, 3.